This morning's gospel passage is a difficult one. There's really no way around it. It is troubling, distressing. I think it's important that we really hear what is happening here. So listen again to the story. Once there was a woman whose daughter had a mysterious illness that no one had been able to treat. This woman lived in the land of Canaan, an area that had been taken over by the Israelites. She was not inclined to trust any of their leaders. But there was one among them, a rabbi, who she'd heard could make people well. She believed that this man was the one who could finally heal her daughter. So even though she was a free woman, she calls him her Lord, a title meaning master. Even though her people had lived on the land for centuries, and even though she did not follow their religious customs, she pleads for mercy and acknowledges his messianic role as the son of David. And this healer just ignores her. His followers start grumbling about her cries, and he just says that she is not his problem. She persists. Putting herself in the posture of a servant, she kneels at his feet and begs for his help. Even worse than ignoring her, he calls her a dog and says that his help is not for her. And still, this woman does not give up. She subverts his insult, saying that even if she is a female dog, there must be enough mercy and healing to go around. At this, the rabbi is astonished by her. He commends her faith, and her daughter is healed. Many religious scholars have tried to either justify or explain away Jesus' actions. He was speaking tongue-in-cheek, or he was testing her. But when we center the Canaanite woman's experience, it becomes hard, if not impossible, to deny that this exchange was pretty ugly. What, then, are we to do with Jesus? This Jesus who we know to be just and merciful. A Jesus we believe includes everyone at the table. Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, a womanist scholar and Episcopal priest, teaches that Jesus was fully, but not generically, human. Fully, but not generically. By this, she means that he was a first-century Palestinian Jewish man who was religiously observant and a product of his culture, including its biases. Now, I know that it is uncomfortable to imagine that Jesus was biased. But you have to do a lot of theological gymnastics to arrive at any other conclusion if you take this text seriously. The scriptures tell us that Jesus grew in wisdom. He had to learn, as we do. He had to wrestle with his culture, as we do. Last week, Rebecca Lyman preached in part that we might consider Jesus himself to be a living parable. And what a profound example we have of that here today. In a parable, there is usually the unexpected twist. A tiny mustard seed becomes a great bush. The shepherd leaves 99 sheep to go find one. There is often a role reversal. The poor, the outcast, the stranger are the ones who recognize God's goodness and mercy. And the wealthy, upstanding, the religious leaders who are respected are the ones who are most in need of that. Parables are meant to be shocking. They open us to something we might otherwise not be willing or able to see. Some of these parables have become so culturally embedded that we don't notice their unsettling qualities anymore. We say Good Samaritan without thinking twice about how radical that would have sounded to Jesus' original audience. But luckily, this one has not been co-opted. I have yet to hear anyone talk about the parable of the Savior who called a woman a dog. It still has the power to shake us, to disturb us. Jesus lives into his own parabolic teaching. In this case, it is a woman from Canaan, whose land the Israelites conquered, who shows Jesus, the respected teacher and healer, that his vision is too narrow, that God's justice and mercy must be spread much, much wider. Jewish scholar Amy Jill Levine says that parables give us the ability to live into what should be rather than what is. They move us always toward enacting more fully the liberating, life-giving, loving reign of God. Prior to this encounter, Jesus had made it clear to his disciples that they are not to go to Gentile towns, but rather that they are to focus all their preaching and ministry on the house of Israel. By the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus proclaims that his disciples are to go to all nations. This woman's astounding boundary crossing and absolute conviction that he is the one to bring healing to all people has broken his mission wide open. Most of us are Gentiles. We can believe because she believed. We are the beneficiaries of her persistence and the inheritors of her blessing. Thanks be to God for this unnamed woman who radically altered the scope of Jesus' ministry. Jesus was a product of his culture, including its biases. What good news! Because so are we. If Jesus had been free from all the baggage of his culture, if he knew nothing of the insidious divisiveness that plagues human community, we might have very little hope of actually overcoming it ourselves. But in fact, God emptied God's self and became fully human, living among us as one of us, wrestling our demons and confronting the reality of our limited perspectives. And so we can follow Jesus the Christ on the path that leads to transformation. Instead of shying away from this story, we can meet Jesus there with our own biases, being willing to consider the ways that we ignore or dismiss or belittle others. If we can set down the assumption that we know best, even when we're pretty sure that we're doing good and faithful work, we might find that there are voices calling us to broaden our scope, insisting that there is yet more mercy, inviting us to live into an even more radically inclusive community than we could have imagined. It is hard to acknowledge where we've been wrong. It is much easier to confront disagreement with defensiveness and trying to convince the other person than to enter with a willingness to have our minds changed. Our culture tends to demean people who shift position on an issue. But truly, an openness to being transformed in the direction of justice is holy work. Hear this parable again. The realm of God is like when the Savior of the world encounters a woman who challenges some of his basic assumptions. Such is her vision of God's radical inclusion that his call is broken open, that he begins to live more fully into what should be rather than what is. By her persistence, by her relentless pursuit of the holy, he is moved to offer mercy that stretches to include all people, goodness that knows no boundaries, a banquet where no one is asked to settle for crumbs. Healing and the table are offered freely to all. She insists. He is changed. This parable is for us to live as well. May we follow in this way of Jesus, opening ourselves to being transformed.